Okay, so I think it would be irresponsible for me to call myself a polymath, perhaps, on this topic, if nothing more but to legally cover myself for potentially being criminally charged with endangering the public with dangerous ideas or something like that. So I just want to contain my remarks to being, let's say, purely intellectual and principled. And if anyone wishes to critique me on the science of the implication of what I say, then I would just say, please put the form of your critique to the principle, to the idea that I put out, not to the particular form that I express it as. So to make a more, I'm not saying that I can't be wrong. I'm saying that please try to recontextualize the principle of what I'm saying when you address it, essentially. Because I mean, let's say I have more of a model which I probably won't describe that well, but and I'm not even researching the history of the remarks that I'm going to make, but you'll see the quality of my thesis, I guess, from the kind of narrative that I depict in order to make my principled point. So I believe germ theory, which was in essence the beginning, a little bit of the beginning of modern medical science, perhaps. The idea, germ itself, I don't know the exact etymology of germ, but I imagine that it's similar to like the germ that they remove when they're making bread often, because the germ has a lot of the nutrition and the fiber in it, and fiber actually needs to be removed if you want to have a high shelf life for food, because fiber goes off very quickly. So you remove the germ often when you're making bread so that the bread doesn't go off, essentially. But there's actually a lot of goodness in the germ. That's spelled differently to germ theory, I believe, but or it might even have a different etymological root. But in some sense, I think that it's probably something to do with germ is seminal. Is the idea that there is a that what's happening with germs, and I'm conflating these things because I want to wish to combine germ theory with what we now know a little bit about DNA and genetics, because germ theory existed before genetics. But once you start understanding that some germs aren't bacteria, they're viruses, and viruses are, in some sense, they're not living themselves, but they are almost like an epigenetic component. Because, I mean, in some sense, that's how genetic material breaks the interspecies divide, is through viruses. Through viruses, we are in some kind of epigenetic biosphere, I would say. That there's very interesting cross species there's some level of interconnectedness that's happening on a say on a very kind of deep level. And let me just say as well that some viruses that are perhaps less deadly than other viruses. I mean, some viruses are absolutely awful. You know, botulism, the Black Plague. Um, you know, some viruses you can't get over in some sense. They will quite likely take your life. Without very particular direct medical treatment or something like that. And maybe some of the more benign viruses that also kill people, but at a much lower mortality rate and such, maybe the reason why we have those viruses and why our bodies just haven't worked out how to com- completely screen them out 100% is because uh, there's something like an epigenetic feedback that's occurring. Maybe we need these viruses just to keep our immune system on its toes. That maybe if the people that didn't die to these viruses would, in some sense, look, I mean, this is a very fast and loose kind of way of talking about it, but just this kind of gets the kernel of the idea across, is that maybe some people that aren't taken out by some viruses end up incubating much more deadly viruses. And so, in some sense, when they are taken out by the less deadly virus, it's almost like a cull. You're being culled by the epigenetic sort of factors, because maybe if you weren't culled, you would make everyone more vulnerable to a much more deadly virus. That is a that's an oversimplification, but in some sense that might be there might be something of a valid reduction within that. That essentially, if you want to take out all these viruses, which are of the less deadly variety, are you not perhaps creating a weakened immunological system? In some sense, if you are going to artificially remove viruses, then you have to kind of do it in an all or nothing sort of way. You either have to go all the way and kill absolutely every single virus and let there be absolutely no epigenetic cross contamination between species and things like that, or it's perhaps very dangerous to stop what is otherwise perhaps an epigenetic ecology that is in some kind of homeostasis. So the idea that we're going to create a vaccine for a species of virus that there's never been a vaccine before about is a form of sociological human experimentation. I mean, look, you can just say, well, I'm now talking about radical speculation and radical theoretical possibility, and everyone else is just being is actually being more responsible than my random conjecture. But in some sense, I do think that if you remove the thing that, if you remove to some degree the reason why we have immune systems, if you start to undercut the reason why we even develop immune systems, and how our immune systems are kept up to date to some degree, or are working themselves into a state of fit and ready preparation, if you remove that, do you think you get a stronger immune system or a weaker immune system? Obviously, by case, it'll be different, because maybe some people are overwhelmed. Some people will kind of be lulled into a sense of being chronically underwhelmed, perhaps. Perhaps some people that have overactive immune systems will become even more overactive. And then their chronic immune responses will, in some sense, they'll make their immune system is making themselves sick because they're used to actually being in an environment that has more immunosuppressive conditions in it. So you're going to get, what are they called? You go, when you start removing vectors of immunological, sort of pathogens and things like that, we might continue to. I mean, maybe our immune systems are like weapons of mass destruction natively, and if they have nothing to fight, then eventually they'll turn on us. Maybe that's what some viruses are there to do in some sense. So there has to be, on a biological sense, an internal immunological response to delineate what is foreign and what is native. And if you don't have some kind of epigenetic contact that's saying, okay, no, this is foreign DNA. This is not part of me. Maybe that's also how evolution occurs. Maybe viruses are part of a kind of evolutionary epigenetic assimilation, and I mean, and this is how life is connected. This is how famously the epigenetics was essentially, I think, discovered when they realized that plants themselves come up with genetic adaptation, and then suddenly all the plants next to it that are of the same species have somehow they've copied that genetic adaptation. There's been a kind of epigenetic, maybe that's what the immune system and viruses do for us, and now we're removing some of these viruses. So I mean, there are all these kind of short-term sort of ideas about we need to be more cautious, we need to privilege life or something like that. We're trying to save people's lives, and I do want to say at what cost, because in some sense I think that this medical fetishism in some level and scientific fetishism, or of course vaccines must only be good, things like that. When have we reevaluated germ theory? When was the last time that happened, that we kind of created a holistic understanding of these things? And are we not actually just bearing ourselves into an entrenched fascistic position, because this is exactly what the fascists believed. They believed that every ethno-state should have a very strict border, and you should not mix with other people. You should create your own little identitarian bubble. You should create your own little insular little life, and that any damage that is caused because of an external force, that's evil. And if something is caused because of an internal homebred sort of thing, well, it should stay in that society. And actually, the more you kind of tend towards that solution, the more you have to actually entrench yourself into isolationism, because once you start separating nations like that, then it becomes very difficult to ever allow international travel again, and cross cultural exchange, and such, because the more isolated you are, the more specialized and local the viruses become, at least the viruses that are left. And so the only way to get back into a state of allowing people to mix with one another is if you completely wipe out the possibility. In some sense, the whole viral thing, you could say, is a discussed mechanism against mimetic. You could say mimetic mixing, or mimetic warfare. No, we don't want your ideas. Thank you very much. We're happy with our ideas. We don't want to be confronted with having to challenge ourselves with some foreign idea. Thank you very much. We're ethno-fascists over here. Please don't tell us what you think. We're not interested. Please stay on your side of the pond. Please don't ask us questions or speak to us. Don't speak to me and my son ever again. Fascistic. That is the fascist mentality. Uh, um, we've got a collective, thank you very much, we're quite happy, and we're not interested. We don't know how to think for ourselves, we don't know how to justify our understanding, so we'd rather just diminish contact with it. Now, I know that it's an inopportune sort of parallel to make, because maybe there is a case to be made that we should develop a vaccine for the COVID virus. Maybe there is a case to be made. Maybe you can eradicate COVID. But who knows how sustainable the consequences of that are? COVID is something that people have never made a vaccine for before, because it evolves so quickly. So there will be a new strain that the vaccine eventually won't work. I mean, I assume, I don't, and I'm not a medical expert, and perhaps calling myself a polymath is a bit of a stupid thing to do. So I will just say, in my conjecture, it seems to me unlikely that COVID will not continue to mutate. And when there's a new strain, which is now not controllable by the current vaccine, will this new strain then force us to lock down all the nations again? And then what happens when we lock down the nation and we say, okay, actually we've controlled the spread? The new COVID virus exists in this nation and it exists in no other nation. So what does that mean now? Does that mean that that nation can never come back into the fold? You can never travel there. You can never mix with those people again, because until we have a virus for that one. Is that it? So then we're going to cordon off that country, and no one can mix and travel between there, and then what will we do? Until we have a vaccine. So now we're completely codependent on the vaccine producers to allow us to gain access to mixing between countries. All because we wouldn't naturally develop herd immunity, and because we decided to now make ourselves dependent on vaccines instead of, let's say, the ordinary course of at least the pre-vaccine, the pre-COVID overreaction, governmental lockdown expectation which now exists, that now this is how we treat COVID viruses, is that before we even know how deadly they are. And when will we find out how deadly they are? In 2 years' time. So every time there's a new COVID now, we're going to have to say, no travel, everyone locks down until we know exactly what we're dealing with, and perhaps if we have got a vaccine for it. And then we'll switch back on again. So the rest of history will just be this unsustainable mess. so that each country will be able to have an authoritarian government that will be able to dictate cautiousness, dictate how things are treated, because we can never actually get into a state of normalcy in which we can respect libertarian freedom anymore. This is the new normal. All based on what? All based on germ theory, which is the idea that, I mean, I'm making these connections. I guess maybe I don't know what I'm talking about, but I think that we don't actually know what we're talking about. I don't think we know what viruses are. We don't know. We don't understand genetics fully. People forget that. We don't understand evolution at all, in some sense. We don't. We don't understand what we're dealing with, but yet we've got false authorities that talk about themselves as if they're experts, and they say, you know what they're saying in Sweden now. I should actually correct myself, because I said a whole lot of things recently in Sweden about Sweden, and that was like old information. You know, I don't watch the news very carefully, because I care about making more principled arguments than essentially arguing about the facts. So let me update and correct myself in terms of what I've said about COVID in Sweden. So Sweden is probably, in terms of the second wave, has experienced just as much hardship as any other country. You know, what I think is very interesting is if you compare Germany and you compare Sweden, and Germany supposedly has done everything right, is they've been the most restrictive that you could possibly be, probably, in Germany, and with testing and tracing. And how has Sweden compared to Germany? I don't think Sweden has done any worse than Germany. Do you know what they're saying now about Sweden? They're saying, the alarmist expert says that they've been testing the sewage, and you can tell how much COVID there is in the human sewage. So you can go down into the sewers and you can kind of do surveys, and then you can, when you test the sewage in this way, you can anticipate that you're going to have an influx of people into the hospitals, because based on how much COVID is in the human sewage, that's how many new cases there are that are about to manifest as being symptomatic, perhaps. Now, just notice then, he extrapolates from the sewage that Sweden is going to have a problem in the future. So he says this is why we need to be more active, we need to be more cautious, and the vaccine is on its way, so we should just have a lockdown until the vaccine. That's what he says. That's what the alarmist expert says about Sweden. Here's a different interpretation. Sweden did not have a hard lockdown ever. Compared to all the other countries that did, I think they've probably done better than other countries. They probably are closer to herd immunity, which means that if they are closer to herd immunity and they've had the second wave that has made other people that were, let's just say, people that were naturally immune to the first wave are now susceptible to the second wave. So some of the people who didn't get it, some people that got the first wave that were asymptomatic, they're fine. But other people didn't even get it. They weren't asymptomatic. They just didn't get it because they were just naturally immune. And then maybe they're not naturally immune to the second wave. So you kind of had a second spread, but probably a lot of people that got it in the first wave were immune. So you know what my optimistic view of it would be is that when you look at the sewage in Sweden, and you anticipate that this means that you're going to have more and more people going into the hospital, keep on measuring the sewage. That's a good data point, I would say, and keep on measuring the hospital influx. And when you see that these two things don't correlate, then you know that you've kind of broken the back of the herd immunity. You know that you've actually reached herd immunity, although you've still got a lot of people in your hospital system. Because maybe a lot of people now, because there'll also be a second lot of people that will, let's say, be asymptomatic on the second wave. So at the point at which you kind of see the increase in the sewage and you don't see an increase in the hospitalization, to the extent to which that those two figures don't correlate, depending on how reliable that data is, you could probably, within some kind of error bar, you could probably work out that you've actually burned through all the brush. You've burned through all the fissile material. There's no more combustion left in the system. You've actually exhausted the pandemic at that point. And then you can count your losses, and you can compare to other countries and compare to other approaches, and also compare the economic damage and compare other things and work out which public health um, strategy was actually more responsible. And I would still argue that Sweden would still probably come out on top, far above every other country. Um, and also, I mean, and again, in some sense, this also must be contextualized by what we see in the future. Because if we somehow all believe the narrative that we must always have a vaccine, we must always lock down until we know what the death rate is of a COVID virus, again, this would be different if it was a different kind of virus, but we know a lot about COVID viruses. And let me just say as well that we don't know what we're doing when we're creating vaccines for COVID viruses. That is human experimentation in a nutshell. So we have no idea what we're doing. In some sense, I think that we should probably restrict the vaccine to people that are vulnerable. We should not make the vaccine. I mean, that's my personal view. I think that we should not try to get everyone vaccinated. I think that would actually be costly in terms of the long-term sustainability of public health. But I mean, I've laid out my principles. I mean, I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm not a medical expert, and I perhaps shouldn't even or suggest that I'm a polymath. But for someone who is a polymath who listens to this, maybe they can reform what I'm saying into a more cogent and coherent sort of set of perspectives and arguments. But I think that is eminently much more uh, uh, potentially sustainable. Anyway, if we do become a more isolated world, we are going to eventually have much more deadly viruses. We're going to start having the Spanish flus that we used to have from years gone by. We're going to, when people used to travel between nations using ships, because there was such a low degree of exposure, of cross national, international exposure between people's different viruses, you sometimes had very serious outbreaks because you would end up with a specialized pocket of a virus, and then one person from that situation would travel across overseas, and then they would expose a population that had absolutely no exposure or experience to the lineage, to the particular specialization of that virus. And then you would get a virus that would kill children. This COVID virus does not kill children. Obviously, I don't mean that categorically. It will probably kill very, very few children that maybe have, essentially not because they were children, it will kill them because they were severely asthmatic or they were severely already compromised in some other comorbidity from some other vector of ill health. But as a category, children are not automatically, in fact, children are almost automatically quite resilient to COVID. So let's just put that into the recipe of context when we think about this kind of overreaction that we've had. And because we also are going to at some point have to calculate how many people died because of the government response to COVID. How many people lives were impacted? How many days of life were stolen from the population because of the economic impact, because of the educational impact, because of the social impact? This is also a proper part of public health that has gone completely by the wayside because somehow government is just being responsible, even though they're being completely, what is the plan? What is the plan to say that there's a curfew at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock? Why are you stopping people that need to do deliveries in the evening? Why are you stopping people that need to do economic things in the evening? I mean, so you're going to force everyone to work during the day in a more restricted set of time. how does that make the virus less likely to spread? I mean, I assume that the reason why you have a curfew is because you don't want people to have parties with other people in the middle of the night. So instead of just saying you're not allowed to have a public gathering, you say no one is allowed to be on the road at night. So you can't go and be a truck driver and you can't deliver something. You're going to shut down essentially the nighttime economy in order to force everyone to do everything during the day. I mean, like, how does that, how- it's, there's so many layers of, it's just complete overreach. It's just, it's just overshooting everything and it doesn't even make sense. Like, what is the plan attached to it? Does it have a plan? Like, what is the loose theory attached to this? Because it's not a justifiable theory. Like, be particular about what is problematic and why it's problematic. And also, I mean, in some sense, if you did that, then you would realize that you would also caution people in this way. You would say, stay away from people that are vulnerable and try help people that are vulnerable stay healthy. And everyone else, maybe it's actually good if everyone else would get herd immunity. Because there are a lot of healthy people that almost have no risk to their life if they get COVID. And it would be better to do that during summer because then it's easier on everyone's lungs, generally speaking. Before the TB season, if people are going to have COVID and TB at the same time, I mean, that's probably not going to, that's probably going to be very, very serious. That's probably going to lead to a morbidity. Um, so we need uh, fatality. If we were intelligent and thorough and let's say had the foresight, but I mean, you see, there is no stomach for this now because of this crazy identity politics, fascistic, sort of, you must demand, it's this weird kind of lowest common denominator rationality. And it's ironic because you can maximize the lives that you spare against COVID, but you will end up creating more human carnage because of the damage that you're doing because of your overreaction. So it only works because you only care about the death that is caused by COVID, and you completely ignore the death and the loss of quality of life caused by what you're doing to supposedly stop COVID from killing people. And when you're just saying, oh, we need to slow COVID. I mean, they said that we needed to slow COVID before we even knew that we were going to get a vaccine. I mean, that was a hypothetical. And it still, in my view, is a hypothetical because even if we get the vaccine into people, we don't know what the consequences of that action is. We don't know what the long-term consequences of that is. We have perhaps, maybe that will seal our fate. Maybe that will mean that now we will be vulnerable to viruses that will be deadly on a scale that we've never had before because we've never had this level of lockdown. We've never had this level of viral confinement and containment. We have increased the level of viral containment. We might have saved some lives in the interim. We might have stopped the spread of other things. We might have stopped we might have slowed down the spread of other viruses as well. But there might be a cost to that. What that cost might end up being is that in the medium term and in the long term, we're going to have a very, very deadly TB season, maybe. We're going to have, everything is going to be more deadly now when there is a deadly virus. Because now we're going to have sicker people that are alive. So when they actually get hit by a deadly virus, there's going to be more combustible incubational capacity for deadly viruses. So in some sense, instead of letting the I know that this is a heartless metaphor, but when you allow for the brush, the dry tinder in the forest, when you don't allow for the little fires to come through and clear up the dry brush, but you store it up so that when there's a serious fire that comes through, it goes up in a firestorm. While at the same time, because there's been no epigenetic, because when you have all the little fires clean everything up a little bit. They make also everything understand that fire is something that's part of nature as well. And when you try to suppress fire, then you end up inclining nature into disbelieving that there is such a thing, that there should be no fire. We're going to remove fire from the world. Fire, we're going to only have water, no fire. Whenever there might be fire, we'll throw water at it. Even when we don't know that there's fire, we'll just throw water at it. We're going to just flood everything. We'll have so much water on hand that we won't even be able to imagine what fire looks like anymore. And then what happens when there is a fire? Then maybe there'll be nothing alive left. Anyway, I know that what I'm saying is perhaps its own form of scaremongering. But there is something to, I would say, the highest common denominator to be aimed for in a society. Maybe this is why the classical libertarian spirit stays with us, and maybe Sam Vaknin thinks that it's a blip on the radar in the course of historical determinism and geographical determinism. But I actually think that there is something to be said about the middle, something perhaps also to be said about the middle class. I mean, I'm not a rich person. I guess I'm comfortably middle class, although maybe not so. I mean, I'm very time rich, but I'm very. Anyway, to talk about myself is a bit strange. But I mean, my salary is $250. In fact, I'd have to recalculate that. I think it's probably about $230 at this point. But yeah, my monthly salary is $230, but I'm quite comfortable because I get a lot of things uh, for free. Basically, I get sort of free housing, I guess. But I mean, so I mean, I live very comfortably, but in some sense at a huge cost, because in some sense I'm not sustainable in the sense that I can't afford to have a family, or at least not with the standards that I have. So I live very well, but I live with sort of no thought for the morrow. But yeah, so I guess I make myself available to make these glad fly principled conjectures that I broadcast out, uh, just trying to be a responsible guardian for values that have been betrayed, values that should actually be leading my society, that have been utterly discarded and trampled upon by people who don't deserve their positions, that don't deserve their stations, but somehow people still vote for them. Or anyway, because there's a lot of false consciousness as far as I can see. But anyway, I mean, this is just my opinion. Let me stop talking because it's going to get more and more self-pitying. But I mean, in some sense, it's not interesting to share someone's story. I mean, it's more interesting to see what do they have to contribute and is it worth listening to, I guess, something like that. But anyway, I always have problems finishing my recordings, I guess, and now because I can always feel like, oh, there's more that I could fill out. There's more that I could try to give my credentials as to maybe why I have a perspective that's worth listening to or something like that. Because there's so many people that are like, oh, well, he's obviously not someone that I should be listening to because either he's not successful or he's too successful. It used to be that, like, if you had money in society, at least maybe you had something that you could teach other people. Now it's kind of like you're damned if you have money and you're damned if you don't have money. You're damned if you're comfortable and you don't have money, then you're definitely not worth listening to by anyone. So somehow now the only person that's worth listening to is sort of Jack Dorsey or some kind of big tech billionaire who or some kind of celebrity that wears their heart on their sleeve and has a disgusting unthorough ideological confection that somehow promotes the plutocratic governmental, sort of doom spiral uh, that ferries us all towards this these simplistic narratives: COVID bad, government good, control safety good, freedom stupid bad. It's this. And I do think that there is at least some ample healthy skepticism to be had about germ theory. But it's interesting how something like medical science can almost cast a shadow over in, a political issue in some sense, or at least a legal issue as well, in terms of constitutional rights and freedom and liberty. Uh, there's an interesting dichotomy there that somehow the science leads to a moral ideological framework and conjecture, or at least which people are supposedly demanding from their governments. Well, other people are like, this doesn't look like the West to me. This doesn't look like a liberal society to me. This is not liberalism. This is fascism. This is proto-fascism. This is big tech censorship. This is nanny state. Uh, uh, anyway, unaccountable politics. This is being ruled by your inverted commas betters for your own good. Uh, and they're not even trying to pitch it towards the middle. They're not even trying to do anything other than a lowest common denominator swipe at the citizenry, at the dignity of the citizenry and the integrity of the citizenry. They don't believe in the integrity of their own people if this is how they address their regulation, if this is the level at which they pitch their regulation. No trust in the citizenry. And in some sense, I would say that that's a mirror reflection of how little trust they have in their own education system. So they know intrinsically, I would say tacitly, from this level of governance, that they know that their education system is terrible, and they won't even raise those standards. So they treat their citizens like children, and then they won't even they won't even try to educate those children and improve the standard of education. It's unforgivable. It's unjustifiable. I mean, they've hard boiled democracy into a form of plutocratic oligarchy, institutionalized corruption on every level in the judiciary now, to reflect this disgusting form of politics, as everyone just becomes more and more fascistic, and the and that's all that the journalism will push. That's all that journalism cares about, is pushing the narrative of the control of the oligarchy and oh, they're doing it for the right reason, they're trying to do the right thing. It's disgusting. And do they even have a plan? Have they even thought it all the way through? To some degree, it is slightly because these medical experts, these alarmists that come through with these fancy ideas, they're not honest about their own lack of expertise. They're not honest about their own limits of the field itself. They don't describe those things. And that's also, let's say, a problem in legality, because a proper legal tradition would very clearly delineate these things to work out what are the decisions that the judge needs to conclude, and what are the decisions that they're outsourcing to the experts. And they really have to take everything that the expert says very, very tentatively in a legal context. It's tentative expert evidence in some sense, tentative on the legal issues that need to be very clearly delineated out. And in some sense, judges don't even do that careful work anymore, because they just say the government has a prerogative. The government has already endorsed this expert line of evidence. Therefore, you need to have greater expert evidence to even contradict it. It doesn't matter that the actual practices themselves are wholly incommensurate with the Constitution, because so long as they have some kind of propaganda that it's a legitimate government purpose, that's good enough. They're trying to do the right thing, never mind if they're actually accomplishing it. They don't have to prove that they are doing the right thing. They just have to say that they're trying to do the right thing, and that's good enough. Well, sorry, that's not good enough. That doesn't meet the legal level. You actually have to be justified in your government policy, especially when you are in an unjustified way infringing on constitutional rights. And in some sense, they're using this as an excuse to promulgate this quite disgusting fascistic political line, which is that, oh, we're just trying to save people's lives. They're normalizing the idea that if the government is trying to save people's lives or trying to improve people's lives, that they can get away with any kind of infringement. They are proving in principle that they should be able to treat people like putty, like moldable. You know, they can instrumentalize your rights at will for the greater good of the whole. They are normalizing fascism and fascistic politics. It's not justified in an open and democratic and non-racialist country. Um, but I'm leading on or I'm somewhat insinuating all these very draconian moves towards expropriation without compensation to help a state that has been so irresponsible about its own corruption that it has literally completely imploded its own financial basis, because they've so badly damaged an economy that should have been growing every year, but that instead was shrinking every year because of the amount of mismanagement and corruption and theft, essentially. To keep a form of politics that allows extraction to happen from the kleptocratic classes, to protect a completely corrupt governmental system that people somehow still vote for, because of racialist politics, which means that now it's a necessity that they use racialist politics, because if they don't use racialist politics, they can't keep the gravy train rolling in. So disgusting. But yeah, all of these things are so interwoven, I would say. Thematically, it's very depressing. This is how you hard boil democracy into fascistic sludge.